Welcome to the Wing and Tail Boys podcast, your Northeast hunting and fishing destination. I'm Chris,
And I'm Angelo.
and we're your hosts. Join us as we navigate the woods and waters of the Northeast, sharing our passion for the outdoors.
From big game and upland bird hunting to turkey, waterfowl, and sport fishing, we'll cover it all. With 40 plus years of experience in the Northeast, we'll provide insights, tips, and stories to help you make the most of your adventures and, most importantly, experience the wild.
So, tune in, grab your gear, and let's hit the woods together. And remember, success is just a commitment away. What is going on, guys? Thanks for joining us here for another episode of Wing and Tail Boys. I'm Chris.
And I'm Angelo.
And we have an awesome guest today, Kevin Creely of the Mid-Atlantic Outdoorsmen. How you doing today, Kev?
Oh, dude, I'm doing great. How about yourself?
I mean, couldn't be better. We're in the midst of hunting season. Got a couple decent sits in. I mean, I can't complain. What about you, Ange? Got any complaints?
I'm doing good too. I mean, other than the fact that everywhere that I seem to try to hunt in this new location is completely covered in poison ivy, which I've avoided for the most part, but it has kind of found its way into. I think it found its way into one of my gloves because I got some on my hands. But
That
other
sounds
than that,
terrible.
I'm doing pretty good. As we've informed you guys, we're on the board. Wing and Tail is on the board in New Jersey. We need to get Chris on the board for the Tri-State Fight Trifecta Challenge. We also have our guest today, Kevin Creely, who's also going to be helping us work towards our Tri-State Trifecta goals. He's on the board himself, so it's a good start to the season, and hopefully we can continue to pile on these harvests.
Yeah, a little bit of a spoiler alert. We're gonna let Kevin tell his story here at the end, maybe. But Kevin, before we get into our conversation for the day, you're not new to us, but you are new to our listeners. So if you could just take a minute, just tell them a little bit about who you are, how you got into hunting, and I guess your little story.
Sure, yeah. So my name's Kevin Creely. I host a podcast channel similar to Chris's. We're on the Sportsman's Empire Network as well, and excuse me, that's called the Mid-Atlantic Outdoorsmen, and we kind of focus on bringing hunting content that's relatable for folks in the eastern states. I've been hunting I live in Virginia. Primarily, I hunt in Virginia and North Carolina, and I live in basically the farthest eastern region of Virginia that you can possibly go. If you just get on 58 East and keep on driving, you're going to run into where I live eventually. I've hunted there for the past 20 years or so. So I've been hunting since I was about 15. I wasn't actually raised in a hunting family. I was brought into hunting by some friends, kind of in like the high school age, and it was actually primarily dog hunting because that is a very rich culture in the area that I grew up in, and with a lot of pushing deer with dogs, lining up a woodlot, shooting them with buckshot and a 12 gauge. And so I did a ton of that in my teen years and then progressed into still hunting only actually to extend my season because the dog hunting season comes in when the general firearms season comes in. And so that's what got me into still hunting. Once I started still hunting, just seeing deer be deer, kind of learning how to navigate the woods, how to read deer sign to find deer, and not just sit in random open areas like a lot of us do when we're first new into deer hunting. So just kind of learning how to read deer sign. And the first time that I read some deer sign and was correct about it, and then saw deer movement as a result of that, was a huge light bulb moment for me. And then that started the transition out of the dog hunting world, and just seeing deer be deer in the wild was like, wow, this is way cooler. This is what actual deer hunting is. And then wasn't until about 3 years into my still hunting career that I picked up a bow. And that was, again, just to extend my season because I found out you get a whole nother month if you pick up a bow. And I was like, well, all right. So started archery, started bow hunting. And now that's one of my greatest passions. So other than that, man, I deer hunt a lot, turkey hunt a lot. Turkey hunting, I'll typically do 4 or 5 states a year. Deer hunting, I do 1 or 2, mostly hunting around home and in my lease that's in central Virginia. And I like to bow hunt, I like to muzzleloader hunt, I like to turkey hunt, and I like to talk about it.
And I like to talk about it. That's I like that way to write that up.
That's cool. And you know what's funny? I actually feel like a lot of people probably start gun hunting. If I had to guess, I think maybe a little bit more of the digital age that's coming on, and the fact that people are getting a little bit more exposed to some of the deer hunting strategies. I think some people are migrating into bow hunting. Maybe, for me, I know for a fact that, a little bit of the pressures of the economy, needing to, not necessarily needing to, but wanting to kind of supplement my diet with some stuff that I was able to harvest myself and make sure that it's, organic meat. I think a lot of people are actually migrating from gun hunting only into bow. So it's cool to be able to have someone talk a little bit about that being their experience. Chris and I have kind of been subjected to hunting all our lives, but I think we both started off gun hunting as children, and it's just because I think it's a little bit easier to control. It's a lot harder to have, a kid bow hunting. There's just so many moving parts and it's so difficult, and kids can be so distracted that it might not necessarily bode well for them to start off that early, maybe unchaperoned in a woods bow hunting. But it's really cool. And to be honest with you, it's still hot. I mean, it's 75 degrees up here
Oh my
this week. I don't know if
goodness.
you've gotten any relief from the heat down by you. And actually, I'd be interested to know if you were affected by the weather that we've just recently had. Um, but yeah, it's still really hot. It's actually kind of almost making it hard to convince myself to get into woods right now, as much as I want to be in there.
Unenjoyable.
Yeah, it's not that
Unenjoyable
it's
right now.
unenjoyable. I mean, it
Eh,
does get a little cooler, but the bugs are just relentless. I mean, I get riddled, and I mean, I have a face mask on, hat on, long sleeves, long pants. I just anything that's exposed is just getting just wrecked by these mosquitoes. Even through my face mask, my ears are getting devoured.
mhm.
So it's just I'm definitely can't wait for the cooler days to come around.
I mean, bro, for me, if it's over 50 degrees, I can't even walk outside to throw my trash out without sweating. I'm not even kidding. Like it does not take barely anything for me to sweat. So like last week, I went out for my first sit. By the time I made it to my tree, I didn't even start like setting up the sticks or anything. I was literally dripping off my nose. It's like it's so terrible, man. Like the hardest that, and I think I do a good job of it with my clothes and stuff, but my hardest thing to do in the woods is to keep my scent contained because of how much I sweat. So like I literally walk into the woods in just my thermals, everything, if I have something else on, it's unzipped. But my problem is the harness I use gets caught on everything. So I have to zip up before I start climbing and it's just a disaster. That's probably the number one thing I have to pick up on. Um, but you mentioned you started hunting over dogs. And I'm curious to know, was that only for deer or did you get into like upland bird hunting at all when you were younger, like pheasant, grouse, quail, or anything like that?
So no, only for deer. A little bit of rabbit, but mostly deer. And as far as
Okay.
upland bird species, we really don't have much for it here in Virginia.
Really?
Yeah, there's been a quail restoration effort over the last course of the last decade. I've actually seen an increase in quail on some of the
Okay.
properties that I lease. I'll like it's still to the point now where like if you're on a crisp spring morning and we're out like near a clear cut somewhere and you hear a bobwhite quail sound off, it's like, oh, did you hear that? You know what I mean?
That's
Like everybody
awesome.
kind of gets excited. Like
Yeah.
it's still really cool because it's an ongoing restorative effort here in Virginia. Um, we don't have wild pheasant. We don't have grouse,
Right.
or anything like that. So as far as bird hunting is concerned, really it's dove. There is an open season for the quail, but I don't know a single person that goes and targets quail just because
Okay.
they're not incredibly abundant. Um, Great dove hunting, and we have some dynamite duck hunting if you're into that kind of thing. I mean,
Oh,
where
we're
I
getting
live,
into it.
I'm 20 minutes from the ocean. Excuse
Oh,
me, where I live, and I'm right in the slam middle of the migratory path, the Atlantic Flyway. So it's actually kind of side story, real quick. This is gonna take just a couple minutes, but
we got time.
um, when I was a teenager, in those days when I was doing a lot of dog hunting, I had a side job on a farm, and that farm was called Flyway Farms, and it was in the belt of there was like a few homes in this belt of where the Ducks Unlimited brand was like first started, and I've heard
Mhm.
rumors that like they met in this house around the time that it was established. I don't know if that's 100% true or not. It was all just rumored to be from people that have told me there. But there was a big Ducks Unlimited plaque with a bunch of signatures in this old farmhouse on this farm that I did side work on, and it was really cool, man. And that place was on like 1,000 acres. It had a private boathouse. It was right on the causeway. It had marsh channels that went out behind it, and they used to do guided hunts out of that and stuff. And I was just a kid that would help around on the farm and get a couple dollars and didn't hunt there or anything. But it was just really now looking back, it was a really cool piece of history. And I don't, I don't do a lot of duck hunting even now, but still looking back at that, it's just really cool,
Sure. And isn't it crazy? So I just did the math quick in my head. I think all of us are relatively around the same age. So isn't it crazy how when we were growing up, $20 got us so far. We could go to
Oh,
the
dude.
movies, get a snack, and go enjoy some food afterwards. Like now it's like,
Mhm.
what the hell is $20? You know what I mean?
Oh, dude,
Um,
if I checked my checking account back then and I had $100 in it, I'll be like, oh, dude, I'm good this Sunday. You know what I
yeah,
mean? It could be Monday, and I'm like, I'm good, man. Now it's like, if there's $500 in there, it's like, oh, geez, man, I might
that's what
not
I'm
make it through the
saying.
You
week.
can't even leave your
That's what I'm saying.
house with the intent of
Yeah.
enjoying anything without spending at
No,
least $100.
Right.
absolutely, dude. It's terrible. We
Yeah.
picked up Mexican last night for my wife, myself, and two friends, and it was $130.
I
Don't
believe
even
it.
go near a sushi place if you're not looking to spend some money either.
Oh, I love me
Brutal.
some sushi though.
I love
That's
me
one
some
thing we
sushi
don't have
too,
out
but just
here.
at the end of my order, it's like $56 just
Yeah,
for me.
I know. That's why.
Maybe you
So
just need to eat less, Angelo.
I
yeah,
just need a tuna fish. I just need to go out on a boat.
you
Someone needs
need
to
to
take me on a
catch the
boat. I can
sushi is
catch
what
my
needs
own
to happen.
tuna exactly and make my own sushi.
There you go.
That's it. That's it. That's really interesting though, because our upbringing, I guess you could say, in hunting is completely upside down from yours. And what I mean from that is we never hunted with dogs. In New Jersey, it is not allowed. You're not allowed to hunt deer with dogs. Up until 2 or 3 years ago, you couldn't even track your own deer with your own dog. You had to call in a certified tracker who
Oh,
was
wow.
certified with the state. But we did get a lot of bird hunting in. We all started pheasant hunting when we were younger. We all
Okay.
started with shotguns and
And
guns,
they
and
stock the pheasant in our state, so we
yeah, they
don't have
stopped.
like a wild.
We don't have natural. Now, what we did have a very long time ago were a very good natural bobwhite quail population. We really did. Now, I'm curious if your state if your quail disappeared for the same reason ours did. When we joined you on your podcast for that episode, we talked a bit about like TSI work and working in the forest and restorative practices and whatever.
Mhm.
Does Virginia do a good job of handling their forests, like doing timber cuts and thinnings and clear cuts and regenerative practices in the state?
I'm gonna say yes and absolutely not. And here's what I mean by that. So, there's not a on the public land. Sure, there's not a ton of public land in Virginia. There's a couple tracts. One of them is extremely large. It's one of the larger tracts of public land in North America, I believe. And that's on the western side of the state. It's in the mountainous region, and that would be the George Washington National Forest. Um, and they do a really good job of maintaining reclaimed hardwoods there. And there's also some really, I'm talking like century old hardwoods there in that mountain range that's just absolutely beautiful. And that place is maintained to a T. Um, as far as pretty much all private land goes in rural areas in Virginia, what you're looking at is just monetary harvest. And that's just it, man. Cut everything down and then either let it grow back fallow and lease the land to a hunt club until it becomes unhuntable because the fallow thicket gets so tall, or replant it back in pines. And we're in the pine belt, so
Sure.
it's just mostly just pine trees pretty much everywhere you go. If there was a hardwood draw within that pine belt of, like, let's say you had a 400-acre block and you went and you harvested the whole thing, and maybe there was a 20-acre creek that ran through it and that was mature hardwoods, they're gonna encroach and harvest as much of that as they legally can, as close as they can get to that waterway,
Mm-hmm.
and take every single bit of that out, and then they're just replanting the whole thing back in pines. And that's just what every single person does.
Sure.
Either that, or they're going to harvest it all, and then they're going to chop it up, turn it into a field. It's going to be soybeans or corn.
Right.
So it's just, my answer is going to be mostly no, especially on private land.
Okay. Now, the reason I asked the question is because New Jersey is even worse than that. I've heard of one like timber burn. I've heard of one burn in all of my life in New Jersey, and it just so happened to be in the town that I was teaching in last year before I moved to Pennsylvania. And the problem is, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but quail need young, early successional growth forests to
Mhm.
survive. Same thing with grouse. Grouse need young, thick, low growing cover. That's what they live in. Now,
Mhm.
and based on what you're telling me, I think Virginia would be the same as Jersey. If you drive down a highway, if you go anywhere, drive anywhere and look in the woods, you can see for a country mile, whether there's leaves on the trees or not. And that's why it's so important here in Jersey and the tri-state area in general to hunt the thickets. Because if you're not hunting a thicket, there literally is no cover for these deer unless they're using the terrain for cover. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? So if anyone from Virginia, New Jersey, the Northeast is listening, we would love to talk to you about helping us take care of our forest just a little bit better. So,
Yeah, no
with
doubt.
that being said, you know, we touched on the trifecta a little bit, and we got to talking a little bit before we started recording today. And we talked a little bit about what it took for you, what tactics you took to kind of prep and get ready for that hunt that you found success in. The first thing I want to talk to you about is kind of how you attack hunting flatland. On the eastern side of our country, the northern side, and the eastern, well, really the northern side, everything is pretty mountainous. We have the Appalachian mountain range that comes through our state, and
And we're
most of
being
every,
very generous with the term mountains.
yeah. But
They're not
actually,
that. I mean, the tallest mountain in the East Coast, I think, is what, 5,000 feet?
something like that. But we so the bottom half of our state is relatively flat. There's not much elevation change.
It's a lot of marsh
Um,
Mhm.
and pine barrens, like you're
yeah,
similar to your landscape.
exactly.
Gotcha.
Very coastal. You know, the whole eastern side is obviously
Gotcha.
coastal state. And we've been talking a lot on our podcast over the last couple months about hunting the mountains, how to use terrain and topographic maps and all that stuff. So since we have you here today and you hunt flatland, walk us through a little bit about how you scout and attack like a plan of action to hunt flatland.
Oh man, it's a bit of a loaded question. It really depends, I guess, what your goal is. Like for me personally, in early season, my goal is specifically to harvest does, right?
Okay.
Like I try to harvest 3 to 4 does every early season. Like I'd like to get that done in the first 2 weeks of the season, and then I will kind of shift gears into hunting bucks. And the reason I bring that up is because I will hunt because of the way that the terrain is. I will hunt them completely differently. So obviously, you're not using topographic funnels, saddles, pinch points look different. Everything's going to look different in flatland as opposed to a place with some topography to it. You know, you can hunt the saddles, the ditches, the drainages, and stuff like that when you have some topography to hunt. On flatland, if you're looking for a quote unquote bedding area, it's not going to be like a north facing hillside and the way that the sun affects it or whatever, blah, blah, blah. That's not going to apply because it's all flat, right? So a bedding area can look like a lot of things. A bedding area could be thick, dense vegetation that grows up around a pond. Let's say an irrigation pond in farm country, right? That they might use that as a bedding area just because it's the only advantageous habitat in that area. Let's say you're talking about in timber country, like we were talking about earlier in the podcast. A lot of these uh, private landowners will go and they'll harvest, let's say, a 300-acre section of pines. Well, 3 years later, that grows up and it's the most dynamite bedding you can ask for. It's nothing but greenbrier that's about chest high, broom straw, short pines, and other some invasive weeds and stuff. But regardless, it's really, really thick, and obviously that it can make some advantageous habitat for the deer to hide in. So your pinch points, your funnels, your bedding areas, all that kind of stuff is going to look vastly different. So you're targeting habitat types rather than terrain traps because there really is no quote unquote terrain traps in flatland because the deer can just walk anywhere, you know?
Right.
So I'll give you a couple examples if that helps.
Sure.
So early season, like my plan for opening weekend, there's a spot that I hunt and it's a large farm. It's about, I want to say it's roughly 700 acres that I lease. And we release 9 different tracks with a hunting club that I share with some buddies. And one of these tracks is about a 700-acre farm, mostly made up of ag. And then there's small pockets of timber. And when I say timber, it's like, I don't know, 20-year-old pines or so. And there's a hardwood ridge that's like up in the middle of one of these blocks of timber. And it's maybe 200 yards long and I'll give it maybe 100 yards wide where it's just hardwoods on top of this one ridge. There's a couple chestnut oak trees, there's some white oak trees, and there's 1 or 2 red oak trees down in the bottom of it.
And
And
how tall would you say that you when you say ridge, are you talking it's a little bit more elevated than the rest of the land around it?
yeah, when I say ridge, it's maybe 15 foot of a rise
Sure.
around the rest. Like you you could see over the top of it from the bottom of it. You know what I mean?
Okay.
It's not tall enough that you like, oh, I wonder what's on the other side. It's not that. So but my point is, it's diverse in the way that you have this one small pocket of hardwoods and a bunch of pines.
Mhm.
And so in the early season, when those white oaks drop, that's going to be an advantageous spot for deer to be because it's an isolated resource. The white oak acorns that are falling out of those trees becomes an isolated resource. And so that is going to be a good spot to target in the early season because it's a secluded food source that's in the cover. So that's an example of one way that you can trap deer in flat land. And then I'll use another one. My favorite one, and if any of my podcast guests, or excuse me, listeners, venture their way over to this episode, then they're going to know that I've beat this horse to death. But it's just my favorite thing to hunt in flat land, especially in pine country, is that when they go in and they harvest the pines, in our state, there's a law when you harvest timber that you can only harvest up to a certain amount close to a creek. I don't know what the distance is or whatever, but like they'll often refer to it as a riparian zone. And
Sure.
that is where they have to leave mature hardwoods standing along that creek. Well, oftentimes it's mature hardwoods. Sometimes it is pines or other types of timber, sweet gum, non-desirable trees, whatever. But a lot of times it's mature hardwoods because they haven't harvested to that creek in so many years. And so not only do you have a hardwood stand there that's wide, you and I both know you can see much better through hardwoods than you can through pines,
Mhm.
especially in the early season, right? Especially mature hardwoods, big trees with large closed canopy and like a littered forest floor with a lot of leaf litter. You can see a long ways because there's no undergrowth, right? Not to mention you have the creek bed, which a creek bed in flatland is going to be, it's going to navigate buck travel because bucks don't use terrain to travel. So they don't really have many other ways to navigate point A to point B or from this doe group to this doe group. So they'll use waterways.
It
So you've
also
got
sounds like your only thermal draw also, like that thermal pull,
absolutely.
it sounds like it's really only happening from like a temperature change versus an elevation change.
Yeah, they're really the only like quote unquote topographical change that you're going to see in flat country is going to be around those creek beds. That's the
Right.
only time it's going to drop a little bit, right?
Okay.
So you've got the water going for you, you've got hardwoods going for you, which produce food, and then on top of that, you've got a habitat change. And so that in and of its own will create a funnel because you'll have this strip of hardwoods, and then let's say they harvested the pines around it 5 years ago. So it's going to be about chest or shoulder high brush, really thick brush, and then mature timber running straight through the middle of that. And that finger could be 300 yards long. It could be a mile and a half long, depending upon the property, right? And that's going to create a funnel. So just any kind of habitat change, basically, is what
Okay.
you're looking for in hunting hard in flat country. So isolated food sources, isolated bedding areas, and then not so much terrain funnels, but habitat funnels. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't know if you see me kind of looking down and jotting down here, but I always keep a notebook in front of me so that way, when a guest is speaking, I could write it down, a question or something, because my mind goes a million miles a minute. But it almost
I
sounds
get it,
like,
dude.
yeah, it almost sounds like where we are, our funnels and everything. You can almost look at a topographic map and say, okay, this is where this is where you have a thermal pull coming down or a drainage or something, two or three coming in. You can almost identify those on a topo map. But rather for you, it sounds like the deer are finding these funnels. Like these funnels are created out of necessity versus a sensory advantage for these deer.
Mhm.
Like anywhere we find a funnel is most of the time going to be some kind of nose advantage for the deer, whether it is a water thermal pull or using a ridge, traveling the top during the day and the bottom at night, stuff like that. So it almost sounds like it might be slightly easier once you get your boots on the ground, like in flatland, to kind of identify those funnels, especially like in pine country. Do you find that to be
Sometimes
true?
too, like so let me answer you a different way first.
Okay.
So sometimes another way that a buck will use the wind advantageously or a quote unquote funnel, like especially during the rut. We'll use the rut as an example because that's a really easy example. So if you have, let's say, harvested timber that was harvested 4 years ago, 5 years ago, that's kind of like I keep mentioning that year range. That's kind of the prime bedding range for harvested pines. Like if it gets replanted in pines, 4 to 5 years, it's chest to shoulder high. It's high enough that there will be deer trails in it. Deer can still travel through it. Once you get to like the 7, 8, 9, 10 year range of cutover, clear cut, whatever you want to call it, where they've harvested the pines and either let it grow fallow or replanted it in pines, but they haven't gone in and burned it, thinned it, or anything like that yet, and it's growing up really thick, it becomes like impenetrable for deer. So before that, in the 3 to 5 year range, let's say it's 300 acres of pines that was harvested, and then there's a creek on the south end of that property that parallels that entire harvest, right? A buck, if you let's say, so again, let me paint the picture. The clear cut is to the north, 300 acres of clear cut that's 3 to 4 years old. And then on the southernmost part of the property, you've got a creek that parallels that entire clear cut, right? And let's say it's November 8th, and we have a predominantly north wind, like pretty good wind, 8 to 12 or something, or
Coming out
or
of the
better than
north,
that.
coming out of the
Yep,
north, or
coming
going to?
coming out of
Okay.
the north.
Yep.
So the wind is blowing from that clear cut into that open timber where the creek is.
hmm
That buck will then cruise that edge, that change, where it changes from harvested thick pines to open hardwoods where that creek draw is, and they'll use that creek to stick their nose in the air and wind that entire clear cut because they know does are going to bed either on the edge or just inside that clear cut somewhere. So that habitat change alone will create a funnel in flat land because we don't have saddles and draws and stuff that move out of that clear cut into the hardwoods. So they'll just use the whole creek. And typically, in my experience, I'm no expert on this. I mean, there's people that could tell you better, but in my experience, does seem to use those transitions, those transition areas where the brush meets the creek bed
hmm
more linear. And you'll find deer trails that run linear up that creek along that cutover that are just worn slam out. And then you can look in the edge of those clear cuts and there'll be beds either right on the edge or just inside the clear cut, right? They're usually not bedded out in the middle of that thing. They're bedded somewhere on the edge because if they have the wind advantage, right? If they, like, let's say for a buck, for example, he can bed on the edge of that clear cut, look into the open hardwoods. He can use his eyes to see anything that's coming through the open hardwoods and then have the wind blowing over his back out of that clear cut, and he can wind anything that's coming from behind him. So he's kind of in a bulletproof spot. It's pretty tough to hunt.
For sure.
Now, back to my point. Does will use those creek beds or those transition zones where the habitat change is more linear. And in my experience in the rut, bucks will come from just about anywhere in flatland, get to that transition, and then they can check where the known crossings are in that transition. Does that make sense? So the bucks will kind of cross it horizontally where the does will use it linear walking up the transition line. Does that make sense?
Sure, and that's very in line with a lot of what we hear, what we've learned over the years is that it doesn't matter what direction a doe trail is going. Either your buck is going to parallel that trail downwind so they can wind the trail, or they're going to bisect those trails in different places to try to catch the scent of the doe on that trail. So at least that's similar to the way things work up here a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Now.
I mean, for me, and Christopher knows this, early season, I'm almost always by water.
Yep.
It's the most predictable thing because we know that, and like I told you today, it's basically the end of September, almost the beginning of October, and today was 74 degrees. I mean, it was still pretty hot. And the piece of property that I'm hunting now, even though we do normally hunt in mountainous terrain, the piece of property I'm hunting now is pretty flat. It's inside city limits, and one of the one of the municipalities has hired our club to come in and try to cull some of the deer herd. So,
Okay.
I'm working in a lot of flat ground also, and it's the same thing. Ton of greenbriers, a lot of small undergrowth. It used to be pastures a long time ago, so there are few trees in there that have grown. It was like 50, 60 years ago it was pastures, and now it's just all just thick vegetation with, scattered trees with not a very thick canopy. And really kind of only like around where there was some private property, there's a little bit of a thick canopy that opens up. But most of the deer stick away from that. And a lot of times what I'll find is any kind of like little bowl where there's like maybe a small depression. Obviously, we know the creeks are going to be, in that little bowl as well. They'll create their own depression. But anything near that that's depressed, I find that when I was scouting that property, I ended up spooking a buck out of there before hunting season. And it kind of goes in line with some of the other things that I've seen and tactics that people use in flat country where that's going to be the cooler part of the property because the the heat rises, the cold air settles, and in those depressions, that's where you got those cool drafts coming in. And these deer that are trying to cool off, they're trying to stay in these cool little pockets. Also, we know that it's because it's so hot, they're just, there's very often that they're going to come in and they're just going to get a quick drink before they go fill up their stomachs, and a lot of times that's where I'm seeing the movement during midday. If I can get close to the water, I'll see, the deers that are in the bedding areas closer to the water. They will kind of stand up, take a drink, and then head back in, and they'll feed around in those thick areas where they're bedding down. They're not moving a lot. And just recently, we're getting there too, but you haven't kind of heard my story, and I just recently harvested a second doe for this year. Nice
Right on.
piebald pattern, really, really nice deer.
Oh,
Came
that's
in at
cool, man.
last light, which again is kind of my kryptonite. Is we're filming our hunts. Are you filming your hunts, Kevin?
Negative. No.
So we're
Just-
filming our hunts,
He was
and
trying to figure out if he should glue his cover open or not.
Dude, I can't. Filming drives me crazy, man.
So,
It drives me
I mean,
crazy.
we've been having some encounters. The only thing is, the first deer that I shot, I ended up shooting my camera. I had a crossbow in the tree with
Oh.
me, and the vibration of the limb when I let the arrow go, I think it hit my camera, destroyed the camera I was using, and I didn't get that shot on film. The
I
most
just
recent
sent you the
shot that I
picture of
had.
his deer, by the way.
Yeah.
If you want to check your phone, I just sent it to you.
Oh,
So
yeah,
the
yeah.
most recent deer that I was able to harvest, I harvested literally,
That's
I think, with like
sweet, dude.
seconds left in shooting light. I mean, most of my stuff was packed. Most of my gear was packed up.
I haven't
and
even
I was-
heard this story yet.
Yeah,
This-
he hasn't
this-
even heard the story. We can get there if we have
Yeah,
time.
well, yeah.
Definitely want to hear Kevin's story while we have him as a gift.
For sure.
But yeah, so I've been having a lot of difficulty getting that first one on camera. It's been a little crazy for me. And, one of the things, the most recent hunt that I hunted sign that was exactly what you were describing, right? So, in a post that we had posted on our social media, it was able to be seen that I was hunting on a river crossing. And it was the most well-used river crossing that was there, and saying river is being generous, but it is deep. It's deep in a lot of spots. It's deep where I might even have to not. I might even not even be able to touch with my feet. It does get deep in some spots. But this one spot was definitely the most heavily used. But like you're saying, the does are the one that are traversing that back and forth, back and forth. They're bedding on one side, they're bedding on the other side, they're feeding on one side. But the buck sign was along the edge, right? So there was a rub line that I was able to follow, but it was paralleling that body of water. And I ended up
Gotcha.
sitting on one side, and it was only this one deer that gave me an opportunity. But I'm hoping to kind of locate these deer a little bit more frequently. But I think it's just really the hot, inclement weather that we're still having. We're waiting for these cold fronts, and we had a combination of a full moon phase that kind of just left us. I think it kind of maybe threw off the schedule a little bit to where, I had a couple days where I didn't see anything, and then on my drive home on the side of the road out in the open fields, or where we live along the highways, the deer will kind of congregate on the edges and they'll eat the grass, but they're just bedded down, and it's like 45 minutes, hour and a half after dark, and they're bedded, so they obviously weren't moving. So I think they're just kind of staying close to the bedding areas, just barely moving out of the bedding areas, kind of getting into an area where they're not completely surrounded and they can kind of maybe get a better view, and they're just hanging out because they just recently fed in the area where they were bedded. But
And so that's
yeah.
one thing that you'll hear. Sorry, you
no,
go ahead.
no, I'm done. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, I was just gonna say, that's one thing that you'll hear a lot of guys talk about in hill country is bedding areas, right? Like you'll hear guys in the Midwest just beat bedding areas to death if you listen to any hunting content that comes out of the Midwest. And a lot of it stems, in my opinion, because they hunt such open ground that the bedding areas become obvious, right? So there's like only a specific amount of terrain that's going to be advantageous for a deer to use as bedding. Whereas where I hunt, let's say you've got 500 acres of pines, super duper monotonous, and you've got a dense deer herd in that area, they can just about bed anywhere in that pine thicket. If it has good undergrowth, I mean, a family group of does could bed slam in the middle of that thing, and each doe face a different direction. They can just bed anywhere, you know?
Yep.
And so, like, when I hear about people targeting specific buck beds and like, oh, I know where that buck's bedded on a north wind and on a south wind he beds here and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, man, I challenge you to come to Virginia and target a specific buck's bed. Like, there's just no way. Like, when you've got 400 acres of clear cut that borders 400 acres of mature pines, it could just bed anywhere. And I've literally before in season been said to myself, like, okay, I have this buck on camera in here. I'm gonna go in here and purposely bump this deer. I'm gonna find this deer and I'm gonna bump him out of his bed. Literally have never had success with it. Like, it is extremely hard to identify a specific buck bed. Now, what I have found is where bucks like to bed in that type of terrain, but I've never found bucks bedding in the same exact location over and over and over. And a lot of times it's not, like I said, like I mentioned before, if you've got that clear cut, they use that clear cut for bedding. And I've known that since I was a teenager because, like I said, I was raised dog hunting. And they would always drop the dogs on the borders of these really thick clear cuts. And then they would line standers up with shotguns in the open woods, right? And then the dogs would push the deer out of those thick clear cuts into the open woods. The deer would run through the open woods, and that's where we would have standers lined up with guns, and they would shoot the deer. And the deer are seldom bedded out in the middle of that thing. I always just picture it in my head as a teenager, like when I drove by a clear cut on the road, I'd just be like, oh, there's 30 deer just bedded out in the middle of that thing somewhere. But that's seldom the truth. It's usually they're bedded somewhere right on the edge of that thing. You know, if you walk the edge of where one of these clear cuts meets the open hardwoods, you'll find beds all along the edge of that clear cut. And if you go and get in one of the beds and squat down, turn around and look at the open woods, it makes so much sense because you can see anything coming through those open woods for a long ways.
Sure.
And another thing with flat land is like, it's flat, right? But there is some slight topographical changes here and there, 5-10 foot rises or whatever. And when the land is mostly flat, if you get up 10 feet, you can see a long ways, you know? I mean, it's like you get up 15 foot in a tree with your stand. How much more can you see than when you were standing on the ground, right?
Right.
So if you're up 5 feet, so let's say I'm on that transition from clear cut to pines, right? Open pines and thick pine clear cut. And I'm bedded on the edge, but I'm in like a 5 foot rise and I've got my back to that clear cut and I'm bedded right there. I can see almost that whole pine stand. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So you as the hunter are coming in to access, and I as the deer embedded on the edge of this clear cut watching these pines. I'm watching you access.
See you.
You know? So it's like, yeah, exactly. And
And
then
you know
they
what's
just turn
funny
around
is
and walk into that clear cut.
we've talked about this multiple times on our podcast, which we're on right now, obviously, but we've talked about the fact that he's hunting a small piece of property in New Jersey where there's a lot of foot traffic from, recreational people, bird watchers, hikers, whatever. One of the properties that I mostly hunt in New Jersey when I hunt public land, other than the property I'm hunting right now, has a lot of the same features because we just don't have these big, huge tracts of woods. And the ones that we do, they're state forests. And people go there to recreate, and there's trout fishermen, and there's even bikers or mountain bikers. There's people riding quads who live nearby, and they'll ride their quads through the properties. So a lot of times these deer are just so alert all the time because there's so much chance for interaction with people that even though there are advantageous thick cover bedding areas, they choose not to bed in those areas, and they'll bed on those elevated points out on the tip of a ridge or on a finger or something like that where, and I've talked about this in an earlier podcast a couple of times. One of the things that I've started to beat, like you were saying earlier, if any of your listeners are listening, one of the things that I've started to beat a little bit is one of the things you said that you like doing was still hunting. That's something that I like too. It's one of the hunting styles I like. And when you do that, I've been watching a lot of information on other people who are experts in it. There's this one guy specifically who has shown me and has taught me a technique that he's found success with is the deer that he's tracking. They know so well how the people move through these areas. They know the trails that people are going to be on. Most of the time, they're not going to be in the open woods. The threats that are going to come from the open woods are going to be predators following their scent on their actual trail. what they'll do is they'll sit on just a slightly elevated spot, maybe there's like a rock lookout or a little point. They'll J hook back around so that they can come back off of their trail a little bit. They'll sit to where they can watch a human trail. Most of the time, it's kind of even just closer to parking lots where they know people are going to enter the woods at. But they'll also have a aerial view or just a line of sight to their back trail. So anything
Okay.
hunting them specifically from their scent, they can see them coming. So like I said, they'll J hook. They'll go past it and then they'll hook back so that if it is following them, the person following them or the predator following them has to pass them first and then locate them. And then at that point, they have their escape route. But most of it's in open hardwoods. And especially by the time the winter comes, a lot of the Northeast trackers, they're tracking in the snow. There's no trees, there's no leaves on the trees. So you could see, like you said, for forever. And they've got all the advantage in the world because if they're just sitting bedded down, you're the one using your movement to alert them of your presence. They can see you coming a mile away. And like you said, you can't hunt a specific buck bed. It's the reason why we're talking about this, because they have a bunch of different advantageous spots that they know of that if they're just on a ridge, they could sit anywhere on that same ridge and probably have that same vantage point.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, okay, maybe you're a couple of yards over and you can see a little bit more of this, a little bit more of that. But when the leaves comes off the trees, all that kind of goes away, and you can probably, if they're on a bench or something like that, they could sit anywhere on that bench. They could sit on anywhere on a bunch of different benches, and they're not going back to the same bedding spot every day.
Right.
Mhm.
I gotta. It's really interesting because I don't know if you follow the MSU Deer Lab at all or listen to any podcasts from them or anything.
Yep, I
But
have.
they just recently came out with a study. I think it was like within the last month or two about bucks and their beds throughout the year, and they basically put trackers. Did you catch this study?
I
I
did
did.
see
Yeah, I
something
listened to
there.
a couple podcasts where they broke it down in
Okay.
depth.
So then I won't go too crazy. I'll just kind of briefly explain for our listeners. But basically, what they did is they put trackers on a bunch of bucks. They went out and trapped them or tranquilized them and put a tracker on them and let them go. And what they found was that a buck rarely goes back and visits the exact same bedding site multiple times. What
An
they
important part to that too to mention for your listeners, in that study they collared several age classes of bucks. It wasn't like a bunch of 1.5-year-olds. It was 1.5-year-old bucks, 2.5-year-old bucks, 3.5-year-old bucks, 4.5-year-old. I mean, they
yeah
had several age classes of bucks, and the data was pretty consistent through 3.5-year-old bucks all the way up to like the 7.5-year-old bucks that they had collared. It was pretty consistent through all of that. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, they did a great job with it. And I don't want to take away from the MSU Deer Lab. Definitely go, guys, if you're interested in this information, go to their channel, take a listen to theirs. But basically what they did was they basically made a bedding area like a 20-acre parcel.
I
And
didn't think
then
it was that big.
specific bedding areas. So there was the number 20. I think it was maybe what I'm thinking of is a specific bedding site was within a 20-yard movement because they said, they had to calculate for tolerances and whatever, blah, blah, blah. But after listening to that podcast, I don't even pay attention to bedding anymore. I will maybe say, okay, this is an area where the deer might bed, but I don't calculate a bedding area specifically into my tactics to attack deer. Now, what I will say is, last year on our property, we have our property in New York is kind of odd. Like our property is basically a big bench. With when you first enter, you kind of go uphill a little bit. Then to the right, it goes uphill a bit, and then it goes uphill in the back a bit. But like think about a rectangle with like curved or rounded corners. That's kind of what our property looks like. And the long middle section of our property is essentially one long bench. And I was sitting in this one field, right on the edge of a food plot last year, and 2 different days back to back, I had 2 different 1.5, 2.5, maybe year old deer walk directly under my tree stand. And I mean, literally, I think they laid in the exact same bed. It was the craziest thing, and they just laid there for an hour and a half straight, The one was sitting there coughing up a lung. I don't know if he was like sneezing or whatever the hell was going on, but he was just
Cold or
making a
something.
run.
Maybe
Yeah,
got
he was
COVID.
just yeah, COVID, nice. COVID deer. That's the next thing we're not going to be allowed to hunt for is whatever. Anyway, like one of them was just coughing up a lung or sneezing the whole time, and the other one was kind of just sitting there sleeping with his head up, which was kind of cool to see. I thought deer slept with their head down. This guy was sleeping with his head up. So it was a really cool experience. And that kind of goes back to what you said earlier was like once you stopped hunting with dogs and you started still hunting, you really get an idea of how deer behave. And that is in my like granted I've never hunted dogs, so tell me if I'm wrong, but I feel like that's an aspect of it that you don't really get to experience because they're literally always on alert when you see them when they're getting chased by a dog.
Yeah,
You know?
absolutely. One thing you can take away from it, though, however, and I didn't have the still hunting background when I was dog hunting to really pay attention to these points, but a good buddy of mine, I've had him as a guest on the podcast a couple of times. His name's Caleb, and he's a member of a dog hunting club now, but he's a big still hunter as well, and he still hunts primarily at this dog hunting club in between the days that they're dog hunting. And what he'll do is he'll attend the dog hunts, and don't get me wrong, he kills some deer dog hunting as well, but he'll attend the dog hunts and he actually keeps a really detailed, he's an engineer, so he's kind of a nerd. He keeps a really detailed spreadsheet of where the dogs jump when they're running deer. And when they jump is obviously they're running into either a random group of deer that happens to be moving through the property or they're running into bedded deer. And when they jump, he'll drop a pin where that spreadsheet is, and then he'll go back wherever the next pin is, and he'll wait a week, let the pressure die down, and during the rut, he'll go hunt in between those two pins because he's like,
genius.
we had does bedded here, we had does bedded here. Because he'll listen, you have radios while you're dog hunting, and the guys like the dog drivers is what it's called, the guys that take the dogs in to the thickets. When they jump deer, they'll get on the radio and let you know like what it is, like, oh, we just jumped 5 does or whatever. And Kale's writing it down on his notes on his phone, like 5 does at this coordinate pin. And he carries I don't know how familiar you are with this stuff, but in dog hunting, a lot of guys carry like a handheld Garmin GPS and you can see where the dogs are on the map,
Yep.
right? So, and when they jump, their pins turn red when they start barking. So he'll see exactly where that is and he'll drop a pin. And then he'll go hunt in between the two pins during the rut. And he's had success killing bucks 11 o'clock in the morning, 2
Sure.
o'clock in the afternoon, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. A week later, after the dog pressure all settles down, he'll go in there and kill him. And it's just wild, man. Like,
Yeah.
it's just, yeah.
And I mean that goes to serve to the point of people always feel like you booger up a spot, the deer are gone, they're not coming back until the pressure dies off. I don't believe that. I truly believe that the deer live where the deer live. They just learn how to avoid people or to move when you're not around or to move where you aren't. I don't believe it. That's like us saying there was a break-in in our town, so I'm leaving. You know what I mean? Like I don't really see that. I don't buy that. I don't buy into that.
I also
Right.
think they
Just
win more than they lose.
100%.
I mean, obviously, when they lose, it's forever. But
Forever. Yeah, they only
but
lose
they
once.
win more than they lose. So I think that we think that they're gone, and I think they just are continuing to do what they do. They just are.
That's a good perspective.
You know
yeah.
what I'm saying? Like that's why you see a lot of these mature bucks, how their mannerisms are. Whether you're watching a video on, the outdoor channel on TV or on somebody's YouTube video or whatever else, the mannerisms of a mature buck are much more patient. I mean, during the rut, obviously, is different. But if you talk about just a regular day, coming out into an open field or something like that, the big bucks are way more reserved. They'll stop and stand and scan and wait and watch and, you know, learn about what the other deer are enduring while they're kind of moving out into the space he's trying to get into first. And, obviously, if you're hunting mature bucks only, the buck can be lured out into a space in danger if he's being hunted because we're not harvesting those other deer. But he will always take more time to walk out into the open or, feed along a thick edge first for a little while, let it get a little bit later in the day, knowing that, once the dark comes, one of your dangers is gone. And I think they know that and they're alert to that and they take advantage of that.
Sure. Kevin, just a sidebar here. Do you know the Garmin GPS they were using? Do you know if they're using the Alpha or the Astro, the Garmin Alpha or the Garmin
I
Astro?
don't, man. be
I only
honest with
asked
you.
because I don't know if we've talked about it before, but I actually have a bird dog. I have a short hair, and I used to run them in hunting competitions and stuff. And I have an old version of the Astro, which
Okay.
it's like a GPS. It's a GPS for yourself. Like you use it as a handheld GPS, but then it also tells you where the dogs are. Now the
Okay.
difference is like your dogs when they're running, they sense the bark. It's the same thing for a like a cougar dog or a bear dog. When they tree something, they start barking. The collar notifies you. The way mine works is when he stops and goes on point, it senses that his movement has stopped, and
Oh, that makes
it
sense.
sends me a notification saying
That's
that
awesome.
he's stopped. So, Ange, do you have anything to touch on with the flatland before I briefly go into feed tree type stuff? Okay. So I'm going to be honest with you. This topic's just a little bit selfish for myself. I have now gone out 2 times, and I was humbled a little bit this past weekend. I kind of hang my hat on the fact that I'm very good at finding deer. Now, I don't mean I shoot deer all the time. It's been 2 years now since I've shot a deer, mainly because I've only been hunting our family property, and I'm very selective. I'm not shooting
Gotcha.
small bucks, and I'm definitely not shooting any doe. Passed up plenty of them. But
Hmm.
this
We
past
differ
week,
very greatly in that category.
sure. Now, to clarify, I will shoot anything that is not a fawn. I will shoot on public land without a doubt.
Okay.
When it
Okay.
comes to my private land, we only have 130 acres, and
Gotcha.
there's two schools of thought on this. On a small piece of property, or people when you have private land and you're managing, people will either say, shoot a bunch of does and don't have a lot so that you have to force the bucks to move around. Now, that's
Mhm.
great when you have 6, 7, 800 acres and you have the space for deer to move around and not leave your property. The other school of thought is if you have a smaller piece of property, like under 500, you actually want a lot of doe on your property. Because what a buck is going to do is they're going to lock down with the doe. They're going to spend 2 to 3 days with that doe, and they're going to breed 5 to 6 doe a year. So if you
Mhm.
do the calculation, 5 days at I'm sorry, breeding 5 doe at 3 days a doe, that's 15 days. If you can have enough doe for the bucks to have enough fun with, they don't have to leave your property.
Mhm.
So when I'm talking about private land, that's why I haven't shot doe. My dad has shot two since we've had the property. My brother has shot one, and we've shot two different bucks.
Gotcha.
Now in New Jersey, the first 2 weekends of the season for certain regions that are really high deer population, they have what's called earn a buck, where
Mhm.
you have to shoot a doe before you can shoot a buck in those 2 weeks. And
Yep.
then once the season opens for the rest of the state, you can shoot whatever as long as you have a tag for it.
Gotcha.
So my first hunt that I went out, I walked in, found really great sign, found my first fresh rub of the year. Granted, I couldn't hunt a buck, but it was good mental note, moving forward. This is an area that we know doe like to walk through. I just haven't hunted there before. So I walked in, I got down into the bottom of the ditch. I was on the water, so all of my thermals were pulling down. There was a very slight wind. I did bring some apples in, but I was within a whole bunch of acorn trees. And instead of those deer, I did see deer that time out. And instead of them feeding across me or coming towards me, they were within range. They were about 20 to 35 yards most of the time, but they never cleared the brush to give me a shot. And they just kind of fed away on the acorns and went and did their thing. Not yesterday, Saturday, I went out. And Friday night, I pre-hung a stand. I went in, did a little scouting. I found a trail that I swear to you, you would think that somebody drove through with a motorcycle. I mean, it was just so beaten in that I could see it in the dark. It didn't matter. So I followed that trail, and I actually ended up jumping two doe down at the end of that trail. So I stopped like maybe 60 yards from where I saw them and cut down towards the water that's there, downhill just a little bit. Set
Okay.
up my stand there, and I figured, okay, if there's doe here, this is the only real thicket in the area, so the bucks will be betting, hanging out down here, whatever. Saturday came, didn't know rain was supposed to hit, and the rain was going. It was patchy. It would rain for 10 minutes, and it would stop for 10 minutes, and the wind would blow. But I mean, there were acorns raining everywhere, everywhere. So I'll let you answer that. But anyway, my question for you is: when you're focusing on feed trees, now I think this kind of lines up a little bit more with your North Carolina hunt. I think in North Carolina you have a little bit more terrain, topography change than you do in Virginia, I'm assuming. Or is
Not
that
where I was hunting.
incorrect?
No. Very
Okay.
flat.
Okay. So all right. So then scratch that part. But when you're scouting and hunting feed trees, what other than looking for the trees that are producing acorns, what are you looking for? Like what tells you, what directs you on what tree to climb or what area to go and find a spot in?
Okay, so I want to start with saying feed trees to me is outside of the rut my absolute favorite tactic. Like nothing gives me more confidence that I'm going to see deer than when I find what I would classify as a feed tree, right? Like when I find a tree that I'm like, this is the feed tree. Like I am almost certain I'm going to see deer that evening. It might not be a good deer, it might not be a big buck, or it might just be a couple fawns, or maybe a doe or five, but I'm gonna see deer if I find one of these feed trees. Yep.
Let me pause you there real quick. You said when you find a tree that you classify as a feed tree,
Mm-hmm.
what does that tree have to look like, or what do you have to see around that tree for you to say, okay, this is a feed tree, as opposed to that's just a tree that's dropping acorns?
Okay, so we'll get into that. I'll start with that actually.
Okay.
So a feed tree is going to be like you could have, let's say you have 10 acres of hardwoods that's acorn producing productive oak trees, and in amongst, let's say, 200 acres of property, right? And within that 200 acres, you have 10 acres that's productive oak trees that are dropping acorns. Um, the species is going to matter, but that's more time of year dependent. The feed tree, quote unquote, itself, the sign is what's going to tell you that that's the feed tree, right? And a feed tree is only going to last a short period of time, and then the feed tree is going to move. It's like whack-a-mole. You got to continue to find these things, right? So the feed tree is going to have fresh poop around it, and it's going to have old poop around it. So if it has those two things, that tells you that the deer have been using it and that they're still using it. You're going to see feeding sign around it. It's going to kind of look similar to turkey scratch, where they're pushing the, whether it be pine needles or oak leaf litter, whatever it is, out of the way. So you're going to have droppings. You're going to have stirred up leaves, disturbed terrain, and you're going to have feeding sign on the acorns. And you can look at an acorn and tell, once you've seen it a time or two, whether or not it's been a deer feeding on it or like a squirrel or some other critter feeding on it. A squirrel will take an acorn and break it up into little tiny pieces, right? And you'll see like especially they'll do it when it's green in the early season. They'll take an acorn and they'll break it up into little pieces, and you'll see where it's scattered. It kind of looks like somebody hit it with a hammer and
Saw a
shattered
bunch
it
of
into
those.
pieces. Right. That's squirrel feeding sign. And then the squirrels will either do that or they'll take it somewhere and they'll bury it, where you see the little bit of leaves kicked up where they bury the acorns under there. Sometimes they'll do that. Deer feeding sign, they'll leave the cap. And oftentimes you'll see a V notched out of the cap. It'll either look like a V or like a curved C. And that's where they're actually kind of similar to like you and I when we eat what's a good example? Like sunflower seeds. You pop a sunflower seed in your mouth, you suck on the salt and stuff for a minute, and then you crack it in your mouth and you spit the seed out the side, right? A deer's doing the same thing with an acorn. They're putting that white oak.
First time
Go
I've
ahead.
heard that. That's the first time I've heard that. Sorry.
Oh, cool.
I was trying to jump in between like two different things.
No,
I
you're good,
apologize.
you're good.
But
You're
but
good.
like that V or that C like in there, I've never heard anybody talk about that before. That's awesome
Yeah, it's just
information.
so I can't take all the credit. I was actually taught by a friend of mine. His name's Adam Weaver, and I'll give him a shout out. He's an absolute murderer on feed trees. He's the one that taught me how to hunt feed trees. He's in my hunt club. I joined this hunt club 4 years ago, and I'm talking, this dude's just murdering deer, dude. Like early season, he's killing 3-4 does in the first 3-4 days of the season, one every night. And then on night 5, he goes to another feed tree that's in close proximity to a bedding area, and he kills a good buck. And then he does it again the second night. And I'm just like, what is this dude doing? You know what I mean? And so eventually, like, we became friends, and I tapped his brain a little bit, and then he started teaching me some stuff. But anyway.
Sure, he said you got to do this: wax on, wax off. No,
yeah. And so he showed me the feeding sign thing, and he was like picking up different acorns and showing me like, this one's squirrel feeding sign, this one's this type of feeding sign. You know what I mean? This one's where a deer picked it up, but they weren't super interested in it because it might have had too much tannic acid, and then they put it back down. And it's just, this dude's level of woodsmanship is unreal. But anyway, he was showing me this stuff, and you'll see in the acorn cap where it'll have a notch in it, and that's where the deer has put the acorn in their mouth, busted the cap off, spit the cap out, and then chewed on the acorn and ate it, right? Now, the feed tree is going to have sign under it. It's going to have a ton of sign. Now, if you find a tree that's got a ton of sign under it, but no acorns, you may have found a feed tree that's already expired. Now, if you stand there, I like to stand there and count. And my rule of thumb, for me personally, I don't know if there's any science behind this, but my rule of thumb for me personally is 30 seconds. I'll count to 30 seconds, and if I don't hear an acorn drop, then that's not the tree, right? And so like I'll stand there, and we'll go back to my North Carolina story. That plays a role later. But you'll stand there and count. And if you can make it to 30 and you don't hear an acorn fall, it may not be advantageous to hunt there. Like I said, let's say we walked up on a tree and it had a ton of sign, but it's not actively dropping. They might have already eaten all the acorns and they've moved on to another tree. So you're close, but you just got to keep looking, you know? Now, you might find a tree that's got 50, 100,000 acorns on the ground. You know, people always use the term, you're rolling your ankle on the acorns. There's so many, right? You walk up and you see that, and I used to be the guy that would be like, oh yeah, I'm hunting here, you know? But look around the tree, and if there's no feeding sign, then what are you hunting? You're just hunting, you're just staring at a pile of acorns. You know what I
Sure.
mean?
Yeah.
So there's gotta be poop. That's the biggest one. The biggest one is fresh poop, right? Fresh poop is the number one thing for a feed tree, and then feeding sign, where you can see where the caps have been busted off and where you can see where the leaves have been moved around.
Sure.
Learning your feed trees, like just learning your different oak trees, is going to help you a ton too. I'll give a shout out to a guy on YouTube. I don't know if you've ever watched Catman Outdoors videos, but this guy has a fantastic video on Eastern oak tree identification. And I watch it every single year to give myself a refresher course where he goes through 20 different species of oak trees, identifies them by the size of the lobe, the veins, the sinuses on the leaf itself,
Wow.
the type of acorn, what time of year they produce, what creates pollination for that tree in the springtime, and then the different levels of tannic acid and deer preference levels for those trees.
Wow.
And it's dynamite. I mean, he did a dynamite job.
And who is this?
Anyway.
You said Catman Outdoors?
Yeah, Catman Outdoors. That guy does a fantastic job. He's got some great videos
I'm
too.
definitely gonna have to listen to that because
Yeah, you need to go watch that video.
my understanding of oaks as of now is rounded leaves, white oak,
Yep.
pointed leaves, red oak.
Red oak. Yeah,
And
that's good. That's a good start.
And that's pretty much what I know. I mean, I've gotten with we talked a bit about like my forestry business on on your podcast that we did with you.
Mhm.
But I'm learning now to identify trees by the bark. Like the leaves are pretty easy, but
Mhm.
a lot of the times when we're doing work in the woods, or especially when we're hunting, there are no leaves on the trees, you know. So
Right.
that
Right.
that is, I'm getting better at it, but it's still kind of tough, especially when you have three different trees that are different species and the difference in them is so small. Like
Mhm.
for example, like soft maple versus goosefoot maple. If I didn't
Mhm.
see the leaves and see the actual goosefoot shape, I don't know that I could identify them.
Right.
If in maturity, when they're younger, the bark looks a lot different. They almost stand out to you, but that's besides the point. But
Mhm.
it's interesting you bring up the point about multiple age scat because Angela and I have talked about this a bunch, and it's probably the number one thing that I talk to new hunters about. So if you wanna get in the woods and just find deer, like if you want to shoot a big deer someday, first you need to learn how to find the deer, and then you can start targeting a certain caliber of deer or an individual specific deer. But I tell them all the time, don't if you're in the woods, don't think of setting up somewhere if you can't find poop of different age, dried up, disintegrating, wet, kind of wet. I'm a huge, that's probably my number one favorite thing to hunt. And lately, we've been talking to so many different people and listening to a bunch of different podcasts, and I'm like, oh, I got to hunt funnels and saddles and water and feed trees. I've gotten away from hunting that different age scat this year. And granted, it's only been two sits. I have to keep reminding myself that it's only been two sits. Like I'm getting ahead of myself. Since we're recording, I'm starting to feel that pressure. Like I told myself all year long I wasn't going to feel it. I wasn't going to allow it to affect me. And now I find myself kind of like I got to get a deer. I got to get a deer. But I'm completely on the opposite end of you guys. Like you guys have shot quite a few deer now, and you haven't gotten any on camera. I've taken one shot at a deer since I started filming, and I didn't get the recovery. I got the hit, I have it on camera, but I never got the recovery. So if we could just put the two of us together, that'd be fantastic.
Right on. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, do you have anything else that you? Oh, big thing. You were talking about scouting to find the active feed trees. Like it's not enough to
Mhm.
find the trees in the summer that are going to drop acorns. You need to know which ones are dropping when you're in the woods. My thing in this internal battle that I always have is I want to scout to find the fresh signs so I know where the deer are right now. But I don't want to put all of my scent on the ground and not have the success that I'm looking for. So how do you
Mhm.
find that happy medium of I need to scout in season, but I also don't want to booger up the spot. Like, how do you navigate through that?
So I'll say two things. Number one, I don't pay any mind to it at all. And the reason being is because feed trees are so temporary, right? They don't last very long. So I'm going to get in there and get aggressive. And I'm only going to hunt them in the evening, by the way. I want to point that out. I'm not going to hunt a feed tree in the morning. If I locate this sign, I'm not going back. Some guys will, and some guys will have success with it. But I'm going to go in there and aggressively scout this feed tree. And then if I find that sign, I'm not going to come back in there and hunt it the next day because I've already put my ground scent all around it while scouting it, right? So my
Sure.
plan when I find one of these feed trees that I'll classify as a feed tree is I'm going to hunt it right now and kill a deer, and then I'm probably not coming back, right? Unless I don't kill and what I saw was really good, then I'll give it one more hunt.
Okay.
But anyway, I don't put a lot of I don't really care about putting ground scent on while I'm scouting these feed trees. I think the deer want to come to these feed trees so bad that they really don't pay a ton of attention to it. Like they're coming, you
Okay.
know. Also, I want to preface this all by saying that primarily when I'm hunting feed trees, I'm hunting does. I'm doing this in the early season.
Okay.
And like I've mentioned before, your listeners may not know, but my listeners definitely know. In the early season, my primary goal is harvest does, fill the freezer. I take pride that I eat a lot of deer meat. I mean, my wife and I will eat 8 to 10 deer a year. The deer I killed in North Carolina, we already ate the whole thing.
It's
It's
gone.
gone.
She go.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we'll eat deer meat every single night just about. And anyway, back to my point. Scouting into these feed trees, I'll walk through the hardwood draw and I'm looking for feed trees. And if I find one, I'm hunting it. And it has to have all the flags, right? It's got to have poop. It's got to have feed sign. Deer trails are helpful. Scrapes and rubs are great. A lot of times you'll have scrapes and rubs around a feed tree. What was your other question? That was your main question. And then there was another thing. Or was that it?
No, I think that was pretty much it.
Okay. Number two thing I want to say.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's very time dependent, feed trees and deer preference, right? Deer are going to prefer one acorn over another acorn.
Sure.
Oftentimes, in my experience.
It's the same
Deer
thing with
are
like
gonna-
specific leaves off of a plant in a food plot. Like sometimes deer will
yep,
be eating it and they'll literally select individual leaves off the same stalk because one is more nutritious than the other.
So what I do know is that deer will prefer white oak acorns to red oak acorns, right? And most people know that. And most people know it's because of tannic acid. If you don't, for your listeners real quick, white oaks have less tannic acid, or tannin is another word that can be used for the same thing. Tannic acid is a preservative that's in the acorn that keeps the acorn from going bad, right? And white oaks have less of it than red oaks do. And the reason for that is that red oaks drop their acorns and they typically don't sprout until the following year. White oaks sprout within the same year when they hit the ground.
Okay.
And because of that, the white oaks have less tannic acid. So the deer will prefer the white oaks during the fall while they don't have all the tannic acid, right?
Sure.
Late season, they might turn back to the red oaks because the tannic acid has started to linger off, right? So, but in the early season, like I'm talking September, red oaks are the only tree that's dropping. So regardless if that thing is bitter as hell and packed with tannic acid, the deer are going to eat it because it's the only acorn on the ground. As soon as the white oaks start dropping, the deer are going to move off the red oaks and they're going to start eating the white oaks because it's a more desirable food source. If neither the white oaks or the red oaks pollinated because it frosted during the spring during the pollination period and no acorns drop, the chestnut oaks are very cold hardy and oftentimes they'll drop regardless of the frost. Deer will eat the chestnut oaks. Chestnut oaks are typically not a preferred food source over white oaks or red oaks. I don't know why. Ask a deer. Don't ask me. But
Ask a deer.
they will eat the chestnut oaks if they're the only thing left. As far as why they feed under a specific feed tree, I couldn't tell you. I mean, it's just up to the deer, right? Like
Sure.
it's got to be. I imagine it's similar to like you and I have probably a different favorite flavor of ice cream. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Where deer will just prefer one tree over another. I don't know why. Maybe it's the time of year that tree pollinated, the amount of tannin that's in the acorn. I don't know. But all I know is you might find 5 white oaks on the same ridge that are all dropping, and one of them will be loaded with feed sign, and the other 4 won't have a lick of feed sign.
Right.
And it don't make any sense to me, but to a deer it does.
But it makes
right?
sense to them. Yeah. I mean, don't come at me with chocolate ice cream, man. I won't even touch it.
Right.
So real quick, I don't want to move on without asking this question. You said you only hunt feed trees in the evening. Is that just simply a personal preference, or is it simply because you feel that they're going to be feeding on that tree in the morning and you don't want to bump them off?
It's 100% that.
Okay.
It's 100% that. Now, yeah, I mean that's pretty much all there is to that. I've never had luck hunting them in the morning. Um, Even if I've had a trail camera in there, like I put trail cameras on feed trees all the time. Like I have one on my lease property right now. I put on a feed tree in August. What I assumed was going to be a feed tree. It's not a feed tree yet, right? But what I assumed was going to be a feed tree because of its location. And that's another thing about feed trees. Location is really important. We didn't even talk about that.
As in
But
like joining with other features, like a feed tree that's in a funnel, or like
exactly.
okay,
Or in close proximity to bedding if you're trying to kill
sure.
a buck. Like
Yep.
if you can find one on the edge of a clear cut, man, dude, if you can find one like you got like a 4-year-old clear cut and there's a big white oak on the edge of that thing where they cut the pines right up to the edge, but they didn't harvest that big giant white oak that was right on the edge, and
Yeah.
that thing's dropping right on the edge of the clear cut, and then you got open pines on the other side where you can access. Boy, that's a freaking spot.
That's awesome.
But
That sounds great.
like this specific tree that I put the camera on, I put the camera there in August because I went out there and I scouted. There was a band of white oaks in this creek. It was right in close proximity to a creek crossing in between two bedding areas. And in that creek crossing, there's a slight rise, a little bit of a ridge, and on that ridge there's a band of white oaks. There's about 4 of them. And I went in there and I glassed up at the white oaks in August, and they were holding like crazy. Just had a ton of acorns in the trees. Obviously not dropping yet, but they were holding. So I put a camera in close proximity to the biggest one that I thought was going to drop first, and I let it sit there. And I didn't get a picture of a deer for a month and a half. Like if I did, it was like a random passing through,
Hmm.
like 2 o'clock in the morning, whatever, just a deer walking by the camera. And then literally last night, it was literally or might have been the night before last. Either way, last 2 days or so, that camera all of a sudden just lit off. We got a slight cold front, and then I had deer in there at 4:30. I had deer in there at 4:45, 5 o'clock, 5:15, 6:30, 7 o'clock, 7:05, all the way up until last light, and then an hour after that. Just separate groups of deer coming in, head down, standing in front of the camera for 10 minutes at a time, and then moseying on off. And
Sounds like
that
you know where you're
leads
going for opening day.
100%, yeah. And that leads me to believe that tree's dropping.
Right.
I'm like,
Yep.
that's why I put the camera there. I was like, I know I'm not going to get deer on this yet, but I know I will when this thing drops. And that
Okay.
was kind of the idea behind that.
I've seen the similar reaction as of late on a very specific rope scrape that I've made, and it's the one that you came with me that one day when I moved it from the one spot I had it to the other. Our property, the way our property lays out, is we have a couple small pockets. And when I say small pockets, I mean like maybe a tenth of an acre here or there of like thicker cover within our property. However, the property along the road, like our road frontage property, is the thickest cover in the entire mountain area of our property. So our property, our neighbor's property, the HOA, everyone on the other side of the mountain of us, like it's the best cover around. And there's a brook that runs through it. So over the past few years, I've always picked up on this rub line that literally follows it parallels the road the entire length of our property. And once they clear the cover and they get to a spot where the cover is no longer thick, they turn and cut up into the property. So finally this year we run Cuddy back cameras on our property. I don't know if you're familiar with
Okay.
Cuddy back, but they have the Cuddy link, and you can have one cell plan. You pay whatever plan you choose. You pay one fee for the year, and you can have up to 20 cameras on this one chain system. So basically each camera sends the picture down to the closest camera until they get to the home camera, and then they send you the pictures, which
Nice.
is it's awesome. I mean, it works great, but most of the time we have them on food plots or like places where we can get a good inventory of our deer. This year I saw on Instagram there was a sale on some cameras. I went out, I bought like it was 4 for $100. I couldn't pass it up. And I
Nice.
started putting them in places close to the road or trails that we frequent often, so that way I could check those cameras easily. And in the last 2 weeks, I don't know if it's a temperature drop, I don't know if it's the leaves falling or the fact that our apples have pretty much all fallen off the trees, but in the last couple weeks, I went from getting maybe a picture on that scrape every few weeks to almost daily. I'm now getting pictures of different bucks, including my number one target buck. In all three places I hunt, my number one target buck has finally shown up on that specific scrape. He's been pretty
Nice.
regular, and by the end of this podcast, I'm going to ask you a couple questions of what you think about my situation there. But same thing, whether it's a feed tree, it's a draw. And the deer
Mhm.
have to want to use that draw. Whether it's a funnel, they're going to use certain funnels certain times of the year, certain feed trees certain times of the year, and scrapes and so on. But real quick, last thing about feed trees, you said that you only hunt them in the morning, in the evening, and is that a year-long thing, or is that simply because you're early season, and when you get to the later season and find like a later dropping red oak or something, are you hunting those in the morning, or is it a strict rule never hunt a feed tree in the morning for you?
So here's the thing. I only hunt feed trees in the early season because in the early season my typical goal is to harvest does
Gotcha.
anyway, right?
Okay.
So I don't want to go in there and blow a bunch of does out and screw that up. As far as when the later season comes in, I don't hunt feed trees in the later season. I know a lot of guys that do and have success doing it. For me personally, around Halloween, I switch to a rut pattern. I'm hunting funnels. I'm hunting downwind of doe bedding areas. I'm hunting in those riparian zones that I like to mention so much, and I'm hunting scrape lines, and I'm hunting stuff like that. And those rut patterns, to me personally, they trump acorn pattern, like the feed tree movement. Now, if I have a bedding area, let's say to the east, and another bedding area to the west, and there's a feed tree somewhere in the middle, and it's within a funnel between those two bedding areas, I will hunt that funnel. I might not necessarily hunt on top of the feed tree, but I'll hunt within that funnel, and I'll keep in mind that that feed tree is there because it's probably going to be holding those does in that area. But I and you both know that during that time of year, a buck's last thing on his mind is acorn. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Yeah.
Like he's thinking about girlfriends, so he's
I
not
mean,
really too much paying attention to getting a snack,
he's got a nut on his mind, but it ain't no acorn. It's
That's
just-
right. That's right. Exactly. Yeah.
No,
So,
I mean,
I tell you what, do you want me to give you the North Carolina story and kind of tell you why I hunted where I did? Because like that'll play like right into the feed tree thing, and it kind of
yeah.
paints the whole picture.
So I mean, we're getting to a point where we want to wrap up. I've done a lot of talking in this podcast, so I'm gonna the
Mhm.
tri-state trifecta was kind of Angelo's birth child there, so I'm gonna let him kind of
Gotcha.
take over for a little bit, and you two can converse about your deer because I'm kind of out on the limb with this one.
Cool. Sounds good.
Yeah.
No, yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
Okay. So, that specific hunt in North Carolina, that was a feed tree hunt, and I went in with the ultimate goal of finding a feed tree. That was the only thing. Like I said, like I mentioned before, if I can find one, I'll have the utmost confidence. In the early season, I used to have such low confidence hunting the early season. I mean, like I would go hunt because season was open and I wanted to hang out at deer camp with my buddies and grill steaks and drink beer at night, but my confidence that I was going to see deer every day was so low. It just was like, cause the deer movement's just less in the early season. It's hot. There's no breeding activity going on. Like unless you're keyed in on a specific food source, which I didn't know how to do, then it's just not that fun. You're just not seeing a lot of deer. You're just sweating. And once I got around some guys at the current hunt club I'm at now, specifically Adam Weaver, guy I mentioned earlier, who taught me how to hunt these feed trees, my confidence went through the roof. So now, as a result of that, when I go hunt somewhere in the early season, that's what I'm going to look for. And so when I went to North Carolina, I went with the mindset of I'm going to go and I'm going to find a feed tree, and that's the tree that I'm going to hunt. And until I find that, I'm not going to hunt. And it took me a long time to get to the point where I could do that because, it gets close to sunset. You want to get in the tree so bad. But I was like, man, I got to find what I'm looking for. And it's more valuable to spend my time boots on the ground looking for what I'm looking for than it is hanging in a tree, just hanging and hoping, that a deer walks by in bow range. So I say all that to say this. The first 2 days I got there, and this is a new piece of public ground I've never hunted. It's about 5,000 acres. I walked and walked and walked and walked looking for red oak trees that were dropping because it was early September, first weekend of September. September 7th was the opener in North Carolina. And I would open up my map on Onyx, and I would look where it looked like there was a patch of hardwoods. I'd park the truck, and I'd beeline to those hardwoods no matter what kind of crap I had to walk through to get to them. Once I got to them, I'd check them with my binos. I'd look at the ground, see if they were dropping. And I bet you I checked 80 oak trees before I found one that was dropping. I mean, I checked so many, I bet you I walked 10 miles the first 2 days. And then because of that, when I did find one, I knew it was going to be hot because that's an extremely limited resource. You know what I mean? Because they're not just dropping everywhere like they are in October.
Especially
And the
since it
one
took
that
you so long to find one. The fact that it took you so
right.
long to walk finding one, it tells you something.
Yeah, imagine the deers out there doing the same thing. You know, they're like, man, I know it's September. Where's dang
Yeah,
acorns?
did I get my dates mixed up?
Yeah, exactly. So, well, the one I did find kind of painted the perfect picture that I talked about earlier. And it was, I was walking through a stand of mature standing pines, and it dropped into a draw, and that draw went out into a swamp. And off to the side of that swamp, up the quote unquote ridge, like the 20-foot rise, up to the right of that, there was dense harvested pines, where it was like 3-4 year old, really thick brush. You know, wherever you hunt, whatever thick brush is and bedding habitat looks like for you, that's what it was up this ridge. It was really thick, short pines, right? So you had thick pines meets hardwood draw meets open pines. So you can access from the open pines, get in the open hardwoods, and you can think that the deer are going to come from that thick bedding, right? Well, I got in there and there was 3 red oaks and they were all dropping. One of them had a ton of feed sign, the other 2 did not. I set up on the one that had a ton of feed sign, and I couldn't count to 15 without this thing dropping an acorn. It sounded like someone was standing up in the tree just dropping baseballs. It was so loud. When I got in there and hung my stand, I was like, dude, if those deer are bedded up in that pine thicket like I think they are, then this tree is just down here ringing the dinner bell. You know what I mean? Like, I'm just waiting. And then about 5:30, some fawns came through, played around the tree, fed on some acorns, ran around chasing each other, ran past me. And then a couple more deer came out, blah, blah, blah. And then finally I looked back and there was a family group of does, big, big, mature one in the front. And I'm like, all right, September 7th, baby, time to get the monkey off the back, you know? And so she eats on that feed tree for a while. The feed tree was actually behind me. And then she starts up the trail. There's a creek straight down from me, and there's a trail running parallel to that creek. And she starts up that trail to move to the next tree that also had feeding sign underneath it. And as she's moving up, I get the bow off the hook and all that. And I get to realize, I'm like, man, this thing's going to be freaking 3 yards if she makes it to, like, if she stays on this trail. And sure enough, she got to, or she's literally about 4 yards from me. I've been at full draw for a minute and a half at this point. And I whistle stopped her and I shot her right there broadside at 4 yards. But luckily she was up the hill a little bit, like off of the creek bed. So the topography kind of helped me to get, you know, a more advantageous shot. Because
Sure.
straight down shot's obviously not ideal. But
That's tough,
anyway, long
man.
story short, killed the deer. And it was in that same scenario that I painted earlier, where you have thick bedding, meets open woods, and there's a feed tree right in the middle. And if you could find that, man, dude, I'm telling you,
that was in North Carolina for you.
Yes, sir.
And you're hunting Virginia as well? Is the Virginia season open yet?
Nope,
Oh,
not yet. I've
this
got
weekend?
6 days. Well,
weekend?
actually, I've got 5 days till the Virginia. Today's September 30th as we record this. We open on October 5. I will be at a friend's wedding. How miserable is that?
Unfortunate.
But
It's right. Our cousin has a wedding on October 8th.
oh god.
Yeah, but it's, you know what? It's okay. It's a Friday, and it gives me a reason to be ready to go for Saturday, Sunday. That's probably the only way you're going to get me to not drink at a wedding, because I'm going to be up on Saturday, and I will be in the woods without
No
a doubt.
kidding. You don't know what makes it worse is I was scheduled to work opening day this year. And I was like, no big deal. No big deal. I'm scheduled to work. Not the end of the world. Because I was off like the next 4 days after that because of the way my schedule falls. So I was like, no big deal. No big deal. I'll miss opening day. It's not a big deal. Well, then my buddy, you know, invites me to this wedding. And I'm like, oh, man, I got to use leave on opening day and not hunt. Like,
Oh man,
that hurt. That hurt a little
it's like
bit.
a double whammy.
Yeah, exactly.
Real quick, I know that I'm gonna say it, but I know it's gonna be controversial for some people. But that's okay. We don't mind getting a little controversial here. But if you, when you have those close shots, right? First off, was she, when you said she was like 3-4 yards away from you? Was she was she coming
Quartering
at
away.
you? Was she
Came
away
from
from you?
behind him,
She
walking
was
to
quartering away.
To your left.
That is correct. Yeah,
Yeah.
she was.
Okay.
She was basically right between broadside and quarter inch away. Yeah.
Okay. So I recently talked to a friend of mine who's part of my archery club back in Jersey, and he actually showed me a video. And there was a part where this deer was feeding around, spotted him in the tree, kind of stared at him for a good 2 minutes, went back to feeding, but started feeding away, felt like something wasn't right. And there was one point where I was like, okay, that's where I would shoot. And he's like, okay, and he was like, all right, watch this now. I waited, and you're gonna see why. And basically, he let the deer get just far enough. Same thing, 4 or 5 yards away, not far at all. But he basically said, in that case, I'm going to wait till they get past me, and I have a from the rear side shot. And he said, I'm going to aim at the spine. If I hit the spine, the deer's going down. If I miss left or right, I'm hitting lung, the deer's going down. And by letting him
Mhm.
pass you, your arrow is angling towards all the vitals versus from the front where you're angling away from the vitals.
That makes sense.
So to those of you, I get it. We all want to make an ethical shot. We don't want an animal to suffer. I think anyone listening to this can agree with that. I have unfortunately hit one deer ever in the spine, and I immediately knocked up another arrow and put a fatal shot into it. So luckily I was able to take care of it. But if you have
Right
like
on.
a trophy buck or a buck of a lifetime or a deer, your first deer, whatever, I know it's not the best shot or the shot that makes you feel the best, but it's not the worst shot in the world to take as far as a harvest is concerned. Aim for the spine. Let them be, quartering away or walking away from you. If you hit the spine, follow up right away. But if you miss left or right, that deer is
I
going
mean,
to
I
die.
think you're talking about something that's directly in front of you, though, and Kevin's was off to his left. Sounds
Well,
like it's like 10 o'clock, something like that.
yeah, I'm just saying, just in general, like if the deer's to the left and he's walking right to left, he's still going to be walking away, or left to right,
Yeah, but I'm just
regardless.
saying, okay,
Yeah,
I get your point. I'm just wanted to
yeah,
clarify that that's when you have, obviously, I don't think Kevin, if he would have shot at the spine, if he would have missed left, it would have went right over its back.
yeah, for
I'll
sure.
say, for me personally, I don't have the patience for that. I'm not gonna lie to you, man. I still get, I've been deer hunting now for shoot, only about 12 years, really. 12, 14, yeah, about 14 years. Yeah, that's about right. About 14 years I've been deer hunting. So I don't really have I feel like I'm still fairly new into my hunting career. 14 years of hunting, I feel like 4 or 5 years of that I've actually had some idea of what I'm doing. You know
Right.
what I mean? So within the last 3 years is when I really started killing deer.
Mm-hmm.
I still get shook up, man. I mean, if you don't, then I don't know what you're doing it for, but I
Wrong
still get
sport.
shook up, man. And
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to take the first opportunity I get that's an ethical shot.
Mm-hmm.
Me personally, like, if once I'm at full draw and that deer's coming in, if I think there's an ethical shot there that I can take, I'm taking it.
For
I'm
sure.
not waiting for a better one. Me
Yeah.
personally. I don't know about you guys, but I'm getting it done.
Yeah, so I was pretty. There was no harvest here. I never actually took a shot, but those deer that first weekend that I got out, and I told you they came through and they were kind of feeding. I had the smallest window. I mean, it was an opening in the thicket. It was literally like a 3 foot opening from tree to tree, and it was cover on both sides. And as
Mhm.
that deer, they must have come in from my left through all the thick stuff because I looked left, there was nothing there. I look right, there's nothing there. I check my phone real quick. I look left, they're standing there. So immediately I flip my camera on, I pick up my bow, I start tracking them with the camera. And as she was walking, I go, okay, if that is my only opening, and I drew back. And she wasn't running, she wasn't moving quickly, but she walked through that opening. And there was a split second in my head that I said, I could take the shot, but I decided not to. And in hindsight, it would have been the
Mhm.
worst shot to take. If she was quartering away, I could barely see her right shoulder, so she was
Mhm.
quartering, left to right, very tight quarter, and I'm almost as excited about not taking that shot, knowing it was a bad shot to take, as I probably would have been harvesting the deer,
Makes sense.
So and it's such a split second game time decision, and I've been
It
on the
is.
back end of making a bad decision or taking a shot that I wish I hadn't taken afterwards. And I try to I tell my students all the time, the only mistake you can make is not learning from a mistake. So your first mistake is a learning experience. Your second mistake is the
Mhm.
mistake.
That's
So
good. That's a good one. Yeah, I like that.
yeah.
Yeah, I had so like I said, we're not open here yet in Virginia, but we have what's called an urban archery hunting season. I don't know if you guys have anything
Mm,
similar. Um, you can hunt within city limits for the first month before season, in specific municipalities, but it's antlerless deer only. And I got invited to hunt with a buddy the other night, and it rained till like 4:30. Last light 7:30. So we got there at like 4:45. We're running freaking late. I've never been to this farm in my life. And he was like, "Hey, walk in the woods, climb a tree. I'm going this way." I'm like, "Oh, okay, cool." We didn't really have time to talk about it. And it's a soybean field, but it's already been sprayed. It's brown. Like, unless they're feeding on the bean pods, they're probably not coming to the field. So I was like, okay, I'm just gonna go get in the woods and find a deer trail, and I'll just hunt. It is what it is. Probably not see deer, but whatever. Walked in, and this place is extremely deer dense, dude. I mean, there's just poop everywhere, and this is just a wide open pine stand. Like, I don't know if this poop that was all in the pines was just because they were staging, waiting to go to the beans, or if it was like sign from the summer. But there was fresh poop, there was old poop, it was ridiculous. And so I found the first trail that I found. It was like 50 yards off the field, beat down trail, and I said, "That'll do," and I climbed a tree. And at about 5:30, 2 deer came in to like 8 yards. And what was funny was when I was standing on the trail looking up trying to pick a tree, I was literally standing on the deer trail, which I don't love to do, but I really didn't have a lot of time to put this hunt together. I was standing on the deer trail looking up trying to pick a tree. I picked one, and I said to myself, this is going to work as long as she keeps walking down this trail. If she stops right here where my ground scent is, it's not going to work because that branch is going to be in the way. But oh well, let's go. It's already 5:15 at this point. And I climbed the tree, and here come 2 deer. 2 big does. One much bigger than the other, but they were both good ones. One probably 120 pounds. That's big in my area. I know you guys are up north. That's a small deer. But anyway, the other one's probably 80 pounds, And comes up to the trail, and she stops right behind that branch. I'm at full draw. I'm like trying to lean off the side of the platform, to get around this branch. And she just won't give it to me. And then I looked left, and the other deer was standing in between 2 pines, and all I could see was the deer's vitals in a window that was probably a foot wide. And I said, well, I can thread that needle. So then I started trying to just ease over to the other deer. And the lead deer caught me moving, and she started head bobbing, and then she bounded off. Well, the other deer stayed. And then I trained the pin quickly to the vitals of the deer between the 2 pines. And I was like, I'm going to kill this deer. But I just had a hesitation, kind of like you were saying. Like, I was like, I don't know about that shooting lane, man. It's kind of, So I was like, I'll just wait till the deer takes a step, clears that pine tree, and then I'll kill her. And then she bounded off. And I was like, dadgummit. And I did see more deer, but none in bow range the rest of that night. But
Sure. It's cool you say that because it was a while back, within the last year, but a few months ago, I watched a video on YouTube where a guy was like, if you get spotted by a deer, it's not the worst thing in the world because that's the one looking at you. So if that's a deer looking at you, make sure you shoot at a different one because they have no idea what's going on. Just make sure you take your shot before that deer stomps or blows at you or whatever, because that's the only deer on alert until she alerts all the others. So that story pretty much puts that to the test and proves it, in my opinion. That deer was nervous, that deer bounded off, but didn't blow, didn't really stomp from what you're saying, and the other deer wasn't alerted until it was too late.
yeah.
So yeah,
And I think I could have killed the other deer, but I'm just like I said, in my mind, if I have a hesitation, I feel like that's a gut feeling, and I'm going to follow it. I'm not going to take the shot. I don't know about you guys.
And
But
for me personally, I'm more likely to take a risk late season than I am early season. I'm really, I grew up an athlete. I played sports. I coach baseball. I'm very big on confidence and carrying your confidence from one thing to another. Right. So I just said I got humbled this past weekend because it's the first hunt in 2 years I didn't see a deer. And
dang, that's freaking good numbers, dude.
yeah, and
I go a lot of hunts where I don't see deer.
they're not big deer, don't get me wrong, but I always find deer. And like that was the one time I didn't. I'm like, shit, man, like I'm my season's over. But it's not over, And I feel like if I take a risky shot like that and I make it, now my confidence is through the roof. But there's a way higher chance of me not making the shot and ruining my confidence moving through the season. So I'm less likely to take a risk early season versus late season. That's just how I attack it. And why don't you go ahead and tell us the story of your piebald here, man? Like I said, I haven't heard it yet. So, I'm excited to hear it.
Real quick before you get started, Chris just sent me a picture of this deer a little bit ago earlier in the podcast. That is so freaking cool, dude. My goodness.
I mean, I didn't even know that it was like that because, again, I briefly told the story earlier. There's really not too much to tell, unfortunately, because it was so dark. It was literally, I have to believe it was minutes, if not seconds, to like the last shooting minute that you could have. Most of my stuff was already packed up. You know what I mean? I was getting ready to go, and I almost actually even told myself that I wasn't even going to shoot it. And I just, the first deer that I shot in this property, I had to donate. We do
Okay.
a donation to a Hunters Helping the Hungry charity locally. Um,
Hmm.
and like you said, you eat a lot of deer meat, and so do I. So for me, I was like, you know what, I really want to put a deer in the freezer. I actually had a wedding to go to the very next day, so I ended up having to take my wife to work in the morning, then drop my dog off at her parents' house, and then come home and still deal with the deer, butchering it. I butchered the whole thing by myself, and I had to get everything done, put away, and cleaned up before the end of her workday, so I could go pick her back up.
Mm.
So I really, honestly, was not even gonna just shoot, but then I got the opportunity that I knew I needed, and I convinced myself at last minute to get it. It's unfortunate, obviously. It was my camera was even put away at this point. I didn't get it on camera, and that's kind of what we've really done. We've said that we're gonna take the shots anyway, whether we can get on camera or not. Just because this
Yeah,
is
deer
something
hunting
new
comes
for us,
first.
and
Hmm.
at that point too, it's like, what am I gonna do now? Sit in the tree and wait for the deer to walk away, or am I gonna risk spooking it and then maybe blow the spot up? So, thankfully I was able to get a pretty good shot on it. I was able to see just enough what I needed to put a good shot, and it didn't go far, and I was able to, get it dealt with pretty quickly and get it out of there. I was
Right
hunting
on.
fairly closely to a road, so I was able to kind of get it out. But, when I walked up to it and I realized, that it had, the pattern that it did, I was, obviously stoked. One of the things I told the channel that I wanted to do this year was I wanted to harvest a deer and maybe preserve the hide. And, I actually took some measures to take some of the flesh off, and I actually stopped and I got myself some salt. And I rubbed the salt into the hide before I was gone, and I put an order into for some chemicals to be able to provide to create a pH bath and to kind of preserve it. Looks like it's going to
Nice.
take me a little longer to get those than I want to, so I'm going to probably have to freeze the hide, and hopefully it doesn't end up creating a problem for me in the future. But I put the salt on it. Apparently, when you do these preservations, you put the salt on it, but then you have to leave it and let it leach out some of the moisture. So I let that happen over the last couple of days, and after we're done with this podcast here in the next minute or so, I'm gonna take the hide, put it in a bag, and put it in the deep freezer and keep it
Nice.
for when I'm able to get these solutions, and then I'll create the pH. I've got some pretty good footage of me fleshing it, so I really hope that it comes together, because that'd be the start of a good YouTube video, instructional video. See if, just anybody wanted to do it, they can do it.
Absolutely. That'd be a
That's
cool
cool,
living room piece too, no doubt.
Yeah,
right?
even if I just
Nice
throw
little
it on the
blanket
bed or
for his
something like
wife
yeah,
on the long car ride,
yeah, something.
Yeah.
Blanket, I don't know, but definitely like a nice little throw rug or something like that, toss under a coffee table or just at the end of the bed.
Yep.
I think it'll be cool. If not, it'll be behind
Yeah.
me when Tri-State Trifecta is done.
Yeah. I wanna get into European mounts too. To be honest with you, my barber here, believe it or not, um, he's got a beautiful deer mount, but behind the chair. And I was talking to him, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I used to do it. I had the beetles and everything." And I was like, "Well, which way do you think is the easier way?" And we went through the three different ways. There's the power wash over and over again. There's the boil, take it out, clean it, boil it again. Then there's the dung beetles. So we were talking about all that stuff, but I would love to get into. I don't know if you've how much of our podcast you've listened to, but I'm a huge DIY guy. Like
Hmm.
I've modified my climbing sticks 4 different
I saw
times
the
this year.
camera arm you finished up the other day. That
Oh
was tight,
man,
dude.
yeah. So I
Hmm.
that is actually that's like 2 different camera arms that I bought. I put them together, like piece them together myself, and the camera I bought was like $1,000 between the camera and the lens and everything. Like I'm not trying to ruin that, so it needed to be sturdy. But the camera arm I was running was 8 pounds at the time, and that's way too heavy on top of everything else that I have. So
Right.
I need something that's light but also steady. Spoiler alert: I am working on designing my own camera arm. So
Nice.
this is kind of like prototype, if you will, of just like the design. And if it works, then I can go into like my own materials and my own base. I want something that's lightweight that could be adjusted in 360 adjustment, or at the very least up and down and left and right for leveling. Because what I found is you can be level left and right like on a tilt like this. But if you're angled up or down, the farther you rotate your camera left or right, the more unlevel you get, which is kind of it's annoying. And if your bolts are too loose, then your camera kind of like drifts on its own. It causes its own little problems. But luckily, I haven't had any of those issues. So I'm going to use it a couple more times and start making adjustments as I go.
Nice.
But real quick, I meant to ask this earlier. You said that acorns have tannin in them, right? The tannins. Isn't that the same chemical that they use to tan hides?
I'll be honest with you, I don't know.
Well, yeah, the tannins, you can a lot of times the tanning too, they'll they use bark. So you can just take the tannins is the dyes. I mean, you can get tannins.
Okay, good. Angelo knows the answer because I
I think the tannins, and again, I don't know specifically all the details, but I'm pretty sure tannins is just a general statement to describe the color, the darker color that anything has. I think even when you talk about like red wine, right? The tannins in the wine are what give it its color. So
Okay. Yeah,
cool.
I was just interested because the only time I ever heard tannins, there's a town in Pennsylvania literally called Tannersville, and it got its name because it was like a town where they did all the hide tanning in the area, to the point where it used to smell. And we're talking decades ago. But the only time I ever heard of tannin was for the tanning process, and then you were talking about acorns, so I thought that was pretty cool. Last thing, I don't want to take. I mean, we're way over what we expected this to be, so I thank you
That's all right.
and apologize at the same time. But
no worries, buddy.
So actually technically tomorrow is opening day in New York. Being a teacher, I don't get the luxury of just going whenever I want. So I have to wait until Saturday to hunt, and my neighbor is going to get a couple days to hunt this buck ahead of me. But I sent you the picture after our last podcast. I don't know if it ever came through or not, but this guy is just a freaking slammer. He's a beautiful 10-point with like crab claws in the front. And he is just a beautiful, beautiful deer. Now, acorn identification, just got it. I'm definitely going to check this out too.
Yeah, I sent you the video, yeah.
So now here's the thing. This is the first.
Oh, yeah, he is a good one. I'm looking at the buck right now. He's a good one.
Man, he is beautiful. I put him at least 5.5 based on the history that we have with him. But this is going to be now our 4th hunting season on this property. And historically speaking, once September, like we have deer all through the summer, thick cover, everything is beautiful. As we creep into September and get closer to October, the deer just disappear. And then come the hunting season, we have a couple spotty bucks, and it's pretty much just doe. This year, for the first time, not only do we have a buck patterned, he is my shooter. That's that guy. I know not exactly at the times he's going to be, but I know roughly the loop that he makes. I said earlier that our property is like a rectangle, and he walks a drainage through it, goes down to the bottom, loops up into our food plots, and kind of goes around. Now, sometimes he starts that loop, 8 o'clock in the morning, sometimes 5 o'clock in the morning. Other times, he doesn't start that loop till 2:30.
Gotcha.
If he's at the beginning of it early, he's going to be on the food plot midday. If he's starting it later, he's going to be on the food plot later in the day.
Good information to have.
Yeah. Now, here's my freaking question, because right? So I told you that the best cover on the property is on the road. Which means if I go into the property, I run the risk of leaving my ground scent where he may or may not be. So I'm trying to decide. I'm going to throw 3 sits in a row at this guy, 3 days in a row, and I'm not sure if I should go to where he's going. I don't know if I should go in the middle of his trail that he's walking. I don't know if I should get real aggressive and push up to where I know he starts, or where I think he's coming out of bedding. I have so much information, and we've talked about this before. The fact that I have cameras and so much camera data, I almost hate it because it makes me overthink.
Absolutely.
So if you had a deer that was this pattern, private property, you kind of have the run of the land, given the situation I just gave you, not knowing any topo information, any food information, anything like that, how would you attack this for a 3-day hunt? I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, whatever my opinion's worth, I guess, but
At least 4
I would
cents.
say, yeah, I'll take that. So I would say, I personally would probably start. Man, it's hard to say. I'd want to say that I would start at the destination
Mm-hmm.
and take the conservative option,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then if that doesn't work out, slowly get more aggressive. But then you risk educating the deer in the process.
Mm-hmm.
So my gut kind of says just get aggressive right off the rip.
Get
You know what I
aggressive right
mean?
off the rip.
If you have an idea of what the deer is doing, it's like, man, maybe not quite push up all the way like tight to his bedding pattern, but like if you can get in the funnel in between where you think he's going and where he's
Mm-hmm.
bedding from, that's what I would absolutely do. I mean, if you have an idea of where the deer's bedding and you have an idea of where the deer's ending up, it certainly can't hurt to get in between those 2 points. You know
Yeah,
what I mean?
yeah. So it's really interesting because he's either so the problem is I have a camera where he's coming from. I have a camera on the road, which is like the middle of his trail, and then I have a camera on one of the food plots where he ends up. He was actually even just sparring with one of our 5, 6 pointers the other
Cool.
day, middle of the day. I'll send you that picture when we're done with it.
Cool.
Just really beautiful. We got a whole bunch of different angles. First we had his ass end facing the camera. Then they both went broadside, and you really just got like a beautiful,
That is cool,
beautiful
man.
picture of it. But I have a camera in the middle, but it is not a cell camera. And I've only pulled the card once. On that card, the back of the camera is facing where he's coming from. I never got him on camera walking with the camera, so either coming from behind or coming to. I only ever saw him on that camera crossing, either left to right or right to left. Every other place I've gotten a picture of him, he's either coming up from the road or going down towards the road, cutting across, and then cutting up. So what I was thinking of doing was taking my first sit, getting real conservative, and sitting on the road. Because if he comes through there, I mean, it's a chip shot. Angelo's been there. I mean, it would be like an 8-yard shot if he comes through that lower end. It's real quick access. There's also a lake on the other side of the road, so it's lake, road, and then uphill. So all the thermals are pulling down towards the water. So if I
So
set
you're not really educating him if you don't see the deer. It's
exactly.
like,
So
gotcha.
I'm thinking day 1, sit on the road, get real conservative. Day 2, maybe go sit on the food plot. And day 3, go deep. Because my fear is if I go deep and he smells me, then the other 2 spots are dead.
Yeah, it's done.
You
Yeah.
know? There is one more option that is kind of in the middle, but it's like it's a chip it's literally a gamble. Because where he's coming from, he could be splitting. And maybe some days he's not going to the bottom. Again, I don't have a cell camera down on the road. The one I have on the road where I've seen him is a pull card camera. And I've only pulled it once. And the one time I pulled it, he was on there like 4 or 5 different times. So there's a spot up a little ways with some apples, which I think is what's kept him on the property this year. It's the first year in 3 years we've had, or 2 years, that we've actually had apples dropping because of late frost. So I could get into this one very specific spot that is pretty much the point of the triangle that he could walk. That might be, if I wanted to get aggressive, but not so aggressive that I'm on him, that might be where I sit. Then
Man, I don't have any apple trees
Mhm.
where I hunt. That's never something I've had the pleasure of hunting, but
Mhm.
I'd imagine they play pretty similar, like hunting acorn trees in the early season. You know, food is king in the early season.
Yep.
Let me preface all this by saying I've never harvested a good buck in early season. So, like, I'm the first to say, like, I'm a rut hunter, right? Like, I hunt the rut. I like hunting the pre-rut, like around Halloween's one of my favorite times to hunt. And I love hunting during the rut. I do. I like hunting rut funnels and like habitat traps and stuff like that.
Sure.
So, my point is, any early season advice I give you for harvesting a buck, take with a grain of salt because it does not come from experience.
See,
But all I know is I kill a pile of does in the early season, and I feel like hunting the food can't hurt. You know what I mean?
right? This guy right here, he's the biggest buck I've ever shot. He was an
Beautiful.
he was an early season buck, 3rd weekend in September.
Awesome.
I agree. I think early season is very tough to hunt because the deer are so strict. They don't have anything else drawing their attention except cover, food, bed, water. That's it. There's nothing else that's on their mind. And if you pressure them too much, they're gone. However, I will say, if you're someone who focuses on finding deer patterns in the summer, like if you're someone who puts your boots on the ground, spends a lot of time scouting, you have your cameras out in the summer, if you can pattern a deer in August, there's no reason he can't be shot in September. I firmly believe that that September is the best time to shoot a buck if you've put the work in from end of season until the season. Because
Makes sense.
once the leaves drop, which I feel is the big change for deer, because that is like a visual change for them, right? Like, yeah, they're losing their velvet, their hormones are starting to go a little bit, but I feel like once those leaves fall and that cover starts to dissipate, that's really when they're like, okay, it's time to change things up. Well, once they change that up, well, now the pre-rut comes in. Now they're scent checking for does. There's really no rhyme or reason to what they're doing other than you need to find the hot doe. Then the rut starts. Then everything kind of goes out the window. And then it's kind of like, it's almost like a climax of a movie, right? You know, like it ramps up, it hits that peak breeding season. And then the back end is kind of the backwards of the season, you know. So you have these patterned deer. As the season goes on, they get less patterned, and then as the season starts to drift off, they kind of slip back into those summer patterns. That's kind of the way I look at it. But that's a conversation for another day. I mean, we are at an hour and 50 minutes. So I want to thank you, but let's take a minute, plug your stuff, plug yourself, where our listeners can find you. Go ahead.
Yeah, for sure, man. So my name's Kevin Creely, in case you haven't figured that out yet. My channel is called Mid-Atlantic Outdoorsmen. Like I said before, we focus primarily on just bringing relatable content for guys in the East. We're on podcast, Apple iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube at Mid-Atlantic Outdoorsmen. We're on Instagram, mid_Atlantic_outdoorsmen, and then Mid-Atlantic Outdoorsmen on Facebook. And yeah, no, Chris, I appreciate you having me on, man. I appreciate this has been fun, man. It's fun to hop on here and be a guest for once instead of a host. This is a good time.
It kind of takes the pressure off you a little bit, doesn't it?
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
You know, and for anyone listening, you know, anyone who follows our Instagram, I'm constantly tagging you and stuff. And, you know, I think we've barely only known each other for like 2 months, 3 months. But I think in our last meeting, we said how we needed to work together and kind of figure stuff out. And you were the first one, really, like you jumped right on it. Like you got in touch with me and we started figuring stuff out. And we've kind of been working together, bouncing ideas off each other ever since. So I'm looking forward to continuing to build that. You seem like you seem like someone I'd like to hang out with. So, you know. that's a good place to start. Man. Yeah, but Ange, you got anything?
We can drink bourbon together for sure. If nothing else, we can drink some bourbon.
Sure. Well, okay. Favorite bourbon, or what were you drinking tonight? Let's put it that way.
Favorite bourbon, Wild Turkey 101. I'm a simple man.
Okay.
Tonight it was Woodford Reserve because my dad bought me a bottle for my birthday, so I had it.
I was just drinking.
We'll have
Woodford
to do some
Reserve.
Hunting too, for sure. I mean, you're big. You like,
not just bourbon drinking.
Bird hunting and stuff, and we're trying to get into a lot more of the bird hunting stuff. And you're going to be coming up to New York at some point, and there's no reason why we can't travel down there as well. So we'll see you soon for sure.
Absolutely.
That sounds awesome, Angelo.
Yeah. So guys, I know this was a longer one, but in my opinion, I think this was the most informational packed episode that we've put out so far. So those of you who listen this long, I hope you got some value out of it. I hope you found something that you can use in the early season here. Feed trees are definitely the way to go. We want to thank you for listening. If you like what you heard today, please take a couple minutes, leave us a 5-star written review on Apple if you feel that it was up to that caliber, and just leave a 5-star review there on Spotify. It really helps us out and supports the channel and kind of gets the name out there for us. So if Ange, you're all done? You have anything else to add?
No, I think we touched on a lot today.
You all good? All right, fantastic. Again, I want to thank you guys for listening and enjoy your weekend. Until next time, remember, success is just a commitment away.